Jesus.
Can Christians and Muslims coexist? I'm Jamie Bambrick for Clear Truth Media, and Nigel Farage recently got in trouble for a speech in which he said the following.
I talked over the course of the weekend to Trevor Phillips about the small but worryingly growing number of young men, predominantly young men, in this country adopting radical views that aren't just un-British, but views that frankly are extremely anti-British. We saw the recent local elections, candidates being elected in inner city districts, in Leeds, in Burnley and elsewhere. We saw the aggression. And you might have noticed that Angela Rayner yesterday was campaigning in her constituency, begging a group of Muslim leaders to please vote Labour. You'll have noticed not a single woman in the room.
Now, what he said here got me thinking about a question that those living in Western Europe really do need to take seriously. Is it possible for Christians and Muslims to live side by side, not necessarily in perfect harmony, not necessarily in a coexist bumper sticker singing John Lennon's Imagine kind of way? I had to watch that video again, as I know you do too. What I mean is a very practical way. Can they live in the same country and it not end up with persecution? Now, I'm of course not saying that Nigel Farage is a Christian, which he isn't, but he is speaking from a broadly, loosely normal Christian set of values, speaking in defense of them in a historically Christian country. And I'm also not asking whether Christians are going to be the ones doing the persecuting. That's really almost never happened historically. Christian countries have been very willing to give Muslims all the same rights afforded to their own citizens, and even sometimes these days those very fancy extra special Uber rights afforded to minorities, so long as those minorities are not church-going Christians, in which case you're not a minority but an existential threat to the future of the nation that you did in fact build. But the question is it possible to have something that goes like that the other way round? And if not, what should we do about it? So, point one. There are more tolerant Muslim countries. So I want to start off by actually trying to be very balanced and fair about this, which is taking a look at the Islamic world and saying that it is not all equally as bad. People often think the worst. That's not entirely fair or true. If you take Indonesia, for instance, which is 87% Muslim, the 11% of the country, which is Christian, does have a high degree of religious freedom, and the country's constitution guarantees Indonesians the right to choose their own religion and the freedom to worship according to their own beliefs. So that's not the same as living under ISIS, and that's a good thing. We can be thankful for that. Similarly, if you go to places like Dubai, which is very cosmopolitan these days, there is freedom to practice Christianity to a certain extent. You can go to church, you can be a Christian, you're not persecuted just for that. You are not allowed to evangelize Muslims there, which then includes all citizens of the United Arab Emirates, because they are considered Muslims from birth. That's a pretty important command of Christ that you're not allowed to follow in that country. Can you practice Christianity there? You can practice some of Christianity. But to be fair, it's not quite the hellscape that sometimes we think of when we think of Christians living in a Muslim country. You've got other examples like this, which are a bit of a mixed bag. Egypt, for instance, does have religious freedom as a right, but it doesn't actually enforce it well. Christians are persecuted there to some extent. Similarly, Nigeria, you've got 12 northern states that are really bad, but also in the same country, you do have a flourishing church in many areas. But there's real serious persecution in parts of the country. I am, of course, not attempting to minimize the challenges the Christians are facing in those countries. I'm just trying to be fair before I go on and say things in the rest of the video that will have a fatwa issued against me. The fatwa is still pretty likely, but I'm hoping by doing this, it will at least be a swift death. Looking forward to that. Anyway, all that to say, there are more reasonable Muslim nations, and lots of Muslim people are in fact very reasonable people. It's not always apocalyptic scenes, and it's not fair to tar everybody with the same brush. That's neither helpful nor true. Point two, however, is this. The track record of Muslims as it regards their treatment towards Christians is pretty darn awful. See, from the beginnings of Islam, one of the things it did was advance through largely Christian regions by force. Muhammad was many things, but one of them was a warlord, and the spread of Islam was through military conquest. Yes, again, Muhammad did have some sayings where he showed some respect for the Christian faith, but in general the practice was come in, take over, and it was a sort of convert or die type sitch, right? Maybe if you were very lucky, you could live as a second-class citizen if you were a Christian. And it's not like that stopped with him and his life. Over the centuries, there were significant military advances made by Muslim armies advancing Islam into Europe. And this was stopped by, let's be honest, some pretty good Christian kings who drove those armies back out again. That is a very different mechanism to spread your religion than the one which Christianity has historically used, which has been overwhelmingly true conversion, peaceful conversion, free will conversion, missionary work, evangelism, and so on. Christianity definitionally doesn't have a concept of forced conversion. That goes contrary to Christian teaching, which is that you need a heart transformation to be a true believer. But Islam is not like that, and even today, you still have a fair amount of forced conversion and forced adherence to it as a religion. If we look at the countries with the most persecution of Christians, Islamic countries dominate that list. Basically all of them except for North Korea and the peaceful Buddhists of Myanmar who peacefully like to slaughter Christians among them. But the rest are, let's be honest, all pretty Muslim. Christians are regularly martyred. Christianity is a religion that has plenty of martyrs within it, and they're not the kind of martyrs which are martyrs for going out and killing other people and dying in the process. They actually die willingly for their religion. So the history of Muslims towards Christians is, I would say, not dissimilar of the history of lions towards zebras. Except that from time to time, by the power of God, the occasional lion has an encounter with Christ and then turns into a zebra and receives eternal life and gets to sing hymns at the watering hole. This analogy has broken down. You get my overall point. It's not all hopeless, it's not all about power struggles, but nonetheless, the dynamics between the two have very much looked like that, like persecution of Muslims towards Christians for the last 1500 years. Now, point 3 is about the growth of Islam in places like Western Europe. It does make sense, with that history in mind, for Christians to be somewhat concerned about the growth of Islam in their own nations. The growth of that population has not occurred by conversion. This hasn't been a revival. It has been through immigration and birth rates. Muslims make up 43% of all migrants, and their birth rate is close to triple that of the native population in the UK, for instance. And this migration is strange because it's not filling some sort of economic need. 70% of Muslim women are unemployed, and when it comes to the economically active populations, only 1 in 5 of the Muslim population are in full-time employment compared to 1 in 3 of the native population of a country like the UK. Muslims have interestingly aligned themselves with left-wing parties in these countries, such as this pro-Palestinian Green Party candidate who shouted Allahu Akbar after winning an election in Leeds.
Raise the voice of Palestine! Allahu Akbar!
Because we all know that the Gazans' number one concern is the CO2 emission of the rockets they're firing. Now, by and large, the church's stance toward all of this has been vague platitudes about gospel opportunities and loving one's neighbour, which does have a degree of truth. But it fails to account for the fact that it's actually significantly harder to share the gospel in Muslim-dominated areas, and that one's neighbour also does include one's Christian neighbour, one's Western neighbour, who might not want to live under a regime like that. And one of the major concerns is a lot of the Muslims that do move here do hold to relatively extreme views, not just compared to the native population, but in fact to many reasonable Muslims in Islamic majority countries. 90% of the people on the terror watch list are Muslim extremists, 23% of British Muslims want Sharia law, and there's now open talk of seizing power and so on. Furthermore, if you take somewhere like Sweden, the city of Malmo is now considered to be more dangerous than the city of Baghdad due to extremist Muslim gangs. If we go back to the lion and zebra analogy, whilst it does seem that a good number of the lions are vegetarian, banking on a lion being a vegetarian tends to be a risk not worth taking. And all of that brings us to point 4. What do we do now? Well, one of the things we need to do is we need to get our categories correct. See, the Christian's personal response to Muslims should be the same as our personal response to pretty much anybody who's not a Christian around us, which is to want to reach them with the gospel, pray for their salvation, be hospitable, and so on. We should show them the same kind of respect that we would treat any neighbour with who doesn't trust in Christ. That doesn't mean you can't have wisdom, doesn't mean you can't think about where you live, but you should also not make sweeping judgments about an individual based off group statistics. However, when it comes to things like voting and like legal policy, Christians, and the West more broadly, does need to wake up and realise that this is likely going to end very poorly if it continues. Biblically, the government has the power of the sword. That means it has the ability to use force mandated by God and is considered to be a minister of God, that is to serve God with that force. That means that they are to ensure the safety and protection of innocent people. And part of doing that is ensuring that innocent people are not persecuted and put under the sway of a religion that has historically advanced by subjugating Christians. Thank you so much for watching. If you like that, do you smash the like button? No. No, you don't, because you're not insane. You press it normally and it works just fine. Click it, tap it, whatever is required. Do that or the relevant kind of thing on whatever platform you are on. Support this channel through wearecontramundum.com. Check out all of our stuff at Clear Truth Media. And if you are on YouTube, where they like to put up the next video, here it is.